this is another BuzzFeed article by Angelica Martinez, and it is called I Research Dark Facts for a Living, and these are 43. And these 43 are some of the most disturbing I came across this year. So, obviously, by the title, some of these are going to maybe be graphic or a little uncomfortable, but they're just unusual facts. So, sit back and relax. This is going to be a long one for you guys. So, let's get into it. Number 1. The Great Pox, aka the 1495 syphilis epidemic that swept across Europe prior to the existence of antibiotics to treat it. Like today, the first stage of the transmitted infection began with painless ulcers, typically on one's genitals, that often went away on their own. The next phase manifested in the form of rashes, swollen lymph nodes, and, at its worst, pustules, which oozed a foul-smelling discharge. Again, these would go away, fooling people into thinking that they cured. In the third and final phase, permanent and more intense symptoms arose. Though they were still alive, infected people's skin and bones would literally start rotting and disintegrating on their faces. This often resulted in the collapse of their nasal cartilage, which made them appear as though they had no nose at all. Other symptoms included formation of gummas, or grotesque was seriously injured. She was sitting in the passenger seat of her grandson's car at the time of the incident and had ordered a hot coffee at McDonald's drive-thru. While parked, she put the cup between her legs and opened the lid, which spilled burning hot coffee all over her. Her sweatpants soaked up the hot liquid, keeping it in contact with her skin. She suffered third-degree burns on 6% of her body, including her private parts, thighs, and groin area. She had been hospitalized for 8 days and required skin grafts. After reaching out to McDonald's about the incident to cover her medical fees, they offered her a mere $800. After the trial, she was awarded $200,000 in compensatory damages and an additional $2.7 million for punitive damages. In January of 1919, the Great Molasses Flood took Boston's North End by storm. While you might think the famously thick, slow-moving syrup surely couldn't be all that deadly, the flood actually unalived 21, injured 150, and caused massive damage. The 2.3 million gallons of molasses traveled at speeds up to 35 miles per hour. It knocked an elevated train off its tracks, crushed buildings, moved a firehouse and other buildings off their foundations, and suffocated both humans and animals. The flood came after Purity Distilling's 50-foot tall tank of molasses split open, wreaking havoc on the crowded neighborhood in the middle of the day. According to structural engineers, the tank was poorly built, the walls were too thin to support the weight of the product, and made of unsuitable material that could, and did, easily crack with sudden temperature changes. While the severity of the flood was a shock, the tank had been experiencing issues long before the catastrophe ever happened. Residents had been complaining about the tank leaking molasses, but in response, the distilling company simply painted it brown so locals wouldn't notice the molasses seeping through its seams. On December 14th, 1799, George Washington was unalived and was nearly attempted to be brought back to life. While he had succumbed to his throat alignment, which there was a debate as to the specific illness, fairly quickly, he tried a variety of remedies from gargling molasses, vinegar, and butter to having his throat swabbed with a salve and preparation of dried beetles. Additionally, he requested his doctor to bleed him and lost 40% of his blood in the process. By the time his friend, Surgeon William Thornton, arrived, Washington was deceased and frozen due to the cold. Thornton proposed they US military has lost and never found at least 3 nuclear bombs. There have been at least 32 known incidences where the US accidentally lost, launched, and set off or had a nuclear weapon stolen. These are called broken arrows. The low reflective bumper on the rear of an 18-wheeler is called a Mansfield bar. It's named after actor Jane Mansfield, who was deceased after her driver ran into the back of a trailer at 2 a.m. in 1967. Jane, her lawyer, and her children, including 3-year-old Marcissa Herrick, were in the vehicle. The car slid under the trailer, and none of the adults survived the crash. Brian's, aka a misfolded protein in the brain that causes other proteins to misfold. This literally causes a sponge brain or small holes in the brain. Brian diseases are always fatal, and there is no known cure or treatment to slow the progression. They can be contagious or genetic. The contagious form cannot be unalived by extreme heat, meaning when people with Brian disease have to have surgery, those instruments used during the procedure are unable to be sterilized. The most prevalent contagious form of Brian diseases is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, aka mad cow disease. Chronic wasting disease, CWD, is another common form of Brian disease, which mostly affects deer. Brian disease can also be sporadic, meaning that the cause is not genetic or contagious, but ultimately unknown. The most common form of Brian disease, CJD, is mostly sporadic and affects an elderly population. Brian disease can lie dormant in the body for years, but once it's activated, the average prognosis is about 1 year. Chainsaws were originally a medical tool used during childbirth. Scottish doctors John Aitken and James Jeffrey invented an early hand-powered version residence up to 40 miles away and reportedly got a 2-ton slab of concrete 200 feet away from the school. The explosion was caused by a cost-saving measure the school had taken earlier in the year in an effort to save $300 a month on gas. Plumbers had tapped a residue gas line. However, there was a faulty connection and gas had been pooling under the school. On the day of the explosion, some students reported watery eyes and feeling lightheaded, but odors hadn't been added to natural gas in the 1930s, so it went undetected. That very year, gas odorization was mandated in the state of Texas. It is physically possible to be so constipated that your stool backs all the way up your digestive tract and you vomit feces. This is a bowel obstruction. According to the medical news today, to treat this, doctors would suck out the contents of their patient's stomach via a tube through their nose in order to decompress the stomach. There is a condition called fibrodysplasia ossifications progressiva, in which damaged tissue is replaced by bone. People with this condition are slowly consumed by their own skeleton and have to choose which position they want to spend the rest of their life in after a certain point. The gritty details of Travis the chimp mauling Charla Nash in 2009. Travis, who'd been raised by Sandra Harold in a particularly human-like life, had been described as agitated on the day of the incident. Charla, Sandra's friend, who had often looked after Travis when she was away, had arrived at Sandra's home to help for the day. Whether Charla offered to come or Sandra asked her is debated by the two. Regardless, Charla drove over and exited the car holding onto an Elmo doll. Almost immediately, Travis homicides involved firearms. The risk is highest for Black women. Contrary to what was portrayed in the Netflix Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story series, what was actually found in Dahmer's Milwaukee apartment was much more sinister. According to police findings, there were 7 skulls, 2 human hearts, an entire torso, a bag of human organs, 2 skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male private parts, a mummified scalp, and a 57-gallon drum that included 3 dismembered torsos. The Oxford apartments that Dahmer resided in were torn down in 1992, and it remains an empty, grassy lot, despite efforts to repurpose it into a children's play area. For hundreds of years, people dumped human, industrial, and animal waste into London's River Thames. By 1858, it caused such a horrendous odor to plague the city that it became dubbed the Great Stink. The river's long-time pollution caused many Londoners to become violently and sometimes unalively ill with chorlorrhea, typhoid, and dysentery, as water wells lied near laking cesspools, and even water pumped from outside the city was still at risk of sewer contamination. In several cholera epidemics between 1831 and 1854, roughly 30,000 Londoners were unalived. In 1855, Royal Institution scientist Michael Faraday claimed the river's water was an opaque, pale brown fluid, and that near its bridges, people could see dense clouds of fecal matter at the surface. Ultimately, the Great Stink and its horrific consequences were the catalyst for London's sewage system, which was completed in 1870. For many, the first sign of cardiovascular disease is sudden deceasement. Sudden cardiac unaliving, as the name implies, is a medical emergency that comes with little to no warning and can take someone out within minutes to an hour. The condition, which is a result of defective scares him than most realize. Redditor, you, Senor Grubb, shared their perspective as a Gettysburg local. The part you don't think about is the aftermath. We think they fight and leave, but it wasn't that simple. Infection and blood loss made battle wounds all the more deadly, which not only resulted in dead bodies, but also contributed to the piles of amputated limbs. According to one Confederate soldier, there were piles of legs, feet, hands, and arms, all thrown together and at a distance resembled piles of corn at a corn shucking. Many of the feet still retained a boot or shoe. It is estimated that roughly 620,000 soldiers passed on both sides during the war. Further, OP pointed out that a lot of these battles were in warm areas during the summer months. Gettysburg was the first week in July in southern Pennsylvania. We're talking 100-degree heat and rotting flesh, bugs, and animals consuming that stuff. The flesh took years to clean up. Similarly, the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and around New Orleans in 2005 was even more devastating than commonly believed. Approximately 1,170 people passed away in Louisiana, with 47% of unalivements being a result of acute or chronic disease, and 33% being a result of drowning. 80% of New Orleans and the parishes surrounding it were flooded by 20 feet of water. Redditor, you, the truck boy, shared their first-hand experience Thomas Mickley Jr. invented both leaded petrol and chlorofluorocarbons. I'm not sure if there is another single individual in history who caused more damage to the environment. Andy was a goose who was born without a beat on a farm in Nebraska. He was disabled for the first 2 years of his life until an inventor named Gene Flemings heard about his disability and decided to create a new method of movement for him. Initially, he tried to teach Andy to ride a skateboard, but eventually settled on teaching the goose to walk in baby-sized sneakers. Since Gene worked with a local charity for disabled children, Andy became a role model and even caught the eyes of the media, with Nike offering a lifetime supply of shoes and the pair being featured on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Andy disappeared on October 19th, 1991, and was later found with his head and wings torn off. The perpetrator was never found. Spiders have exoskeletons that they shed. When you see a dead spider, it might not actually be a dead spider. It could just be its old skin that it molted, and the spider is now somewhere else and bigger. The CIA's Operation Northwood proposed that CIA operatives should commit acts of terrorism upon the U.S. to blame Fidel Castro and justify a war against Cuba. This was rejected by JFK. We know about this because this got declassified. Dolphins can be physically attracted to humans and will definitely try to do something about it. In the documentary The Girl Who Talked to Dolphins, which took place in the 60s, Margaret Howe Lovett participated in said research, which aimed to teach dolphins to communicate with humans. According to The Atlantic, it started with Lovett moving in with an adolescent dolphin named Peter so she could attempt to teach him. Well, she found their lessons to be particularly difficulty when Peter was excited, which apparently happened often. A decent amount of what doctors know about hypothermia and how to deal with it came from the Nazi science in World War II. The DACU hypothermia experiments were medical experiments, or rather brutal torture, conducted at the Dachau concentration camp with the goal of discovering ants into thinking they got out of the colony. In turn, the ants bring them back in. It can also fool red ants into thinking it's the queen by imitating the sounds of an adult queen ant, so the other ants feed it. In particular, it can imitate the queen in distress, which results in them feeding the caterpillar their young. This destroys the ant colony from the inside out. Whale carcasses can explode, and when deceased whales are left on the beach or floating atop the waves, their carcasses can in fact explode due to the buildup of gases like methane inside their bodies whilst decomposing. In 2005, medical staff at Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans were arrested on account of a second-degree unaliving for reportedly euthanizing patients with a lethal dose of medicine in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. The 4 patients, too sick to move, were stranded in the soon-to-be evacuated hospital, which was left without power. Dr. Anna Poe publicly defended her decision, claiming that it was only a humane choice and an impossible situation, and that her goal was simply to help the patients through their pain. On February 3rd, 1998, people were unalived when a cable car situated near the ski resort town of Cavallese, Italy, plummeted to the ground from 260 feet in the air. It was caused by a United States Marine Corps EA-6B Prowler aircraft that was flying excessively fast and too low during a low-altitude training mission. The aircraft ultimately severed the cable supporting the cable car as it was descending. It was going roughly 540 miles per hour at an altitude of 260 to 330 feet. The disaster has been named the Strange Del Carmes Massacre of Carmes in Italy. The pilot, Captain Richard J. Ashby, and his navigator, Captain Joseph Swetzler, were ultimately deemed not guilty of involuntary manslaughter and negligent homicide for their roles in the disaster. However, they were found guilty of obstruction of justice and conspiracy after being found to have destroyed the camcorder footage recorded on the plane's cockpit. When an elderly person falls and ends up with a broken hip, sometimes it's actually the hip breaking that causes the fall. According to the Mayo Clinic, simply standing and twisting summer. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for being here. If you did enjoy this video, make sure that you leave a like. And if you would like to see more content from me in the future, make sure you go ahead